The water was warm. That's what the survivors remembered first, decades later, sitting in quiet rooms far from the Pacific. The water was warm, and for a few seconds after the explosion stopped, there was almost silence. Just the sound of men breathing hard, and the sea settling back into itself around the wreck of what had been, 12 minutes ago, one of the most decorated warships in the United States Navy. 12 minutes. That's how long it took for 610 feet of heavy cruiser to vanish beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea, taking nearly 300 men with it. The 900 who made it into the water had no way of knowing that the Navy had no idea they were there. No rescue was coming. No alarm had been raised. No one at any command post in the Pacific had noticed that the USS Indianapolis had simply ceased to exist somewhere between Guam and the Philippines on the night of July 30th, 1945. What those 900 men also couldn't know, what none of them could have been prepared for, was what was already moving toward them through the dark water below. The sharks had heard the explosion. This is the true story of the worst maritime disaster in United States Navy history, and the deadliest shark attack the world has ever recorded. And it begins not in the water, but in a secret so large, it nearly ended the war. In the summer of 1945, the war in the Pacific was almost over, but almost is a word that costs lives. Japan had refused to surrender. Allied planners were drawing up the most ambitious and bloody invasion in military history, Operation Downfall, a full-scale land assault on the Japanese home islands, projected to cost anywhere from 250,000 to over 1 million Allied lives, and multiples of that on the Japanese side. The war that had already consumed tens of millions of human beings was preparing for one final, catastrophic act. But there was another plan. A plan so secret that most of the men being used to execute it had no idea what they were carrying. The USS Indianapolis was a Portland-class heavy cruiser, 610 feet long, nearly 10,000 tons, armed with 9 8-inch guns, and bristling with anti-aircraft weapons. She had been the flagship of Admiral Raymond Spruance during some of the most significant naval campaigns in the Pacific. She had survived kamikaze attacks. She had 10 battle stars on her record. Her crew called her the Indy, and they loved her with the particular devotion that sailors develop for ships that have carried them through things they cannot describe. In late July 1945, the Indianapolis was given a mission that bypassed normal naval channels entirely. She was to transport a highly classified cargo from San Francisco to the island of Tinian in the Mariana Islands. A journey of 5,000 miles to be completed at maximum speed, without escort, without telling most of her own officers what was in the crates being loaded onto her deck. What was in those crates was the enriched uranium core and key components of Little Boy, the first atomic bomb ever to be used in combat. Captain Charles B. McVeigh III commanded the Indianapolis. He was 46 years old, a career naval officer, the son of an admiral. He was not a man given to sentiment or drama. He ran a tight ship, and his crew respected him. He had not been fully briefed on what his vessel was carrying. He did not need to be. His orders were simple: get to Tinian fast, deliver the cargo, proceed to the Philippines for training exercises. The Indianapolis arrived at Tinian on July 26, 1945. She had crossed the Pacific in 10 days, a record. The crates were unloaded and transferred to the scientists and military personnel who would use their contents to build the weapon that would, in 12 days, level the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The Indianapolis received no special orders for the return journey. No escort was assigned. No one was specifically designated to track her arrival at her next destination. She was a warship operating in the final weeks of a war that everyone believed was almost finished, and she sailed back into the Pacific as if she were simply one more ship among hundreds. On July 28th, she left Guam and turned toward the Philippines. She never arrived. The night of July 29th into the 30th was clear. The Philippine Sea stretched away in every direction, under a sky bright with stars, the water dark and calm at 17 knots. Below decks, men played cards and wrote letters home. Some had visited with the ship's chaplain, Father Thomas Conway. A few stood watch on deck and stared at the ocean, thinking about home, thinking about the end of the war, thinking about nothing in particular. What none of them knew was that the Japanese submarine I-58 was watching them. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto had spotted the silhouette of the Indianapolis against the moonlit water. He initially thought he was looking at a battleship, something larger and more valuable than a cruiser. He ordered his crew to prepare a spread of 6 torpedoes. At 12:14 in the morning on July 30th, 1945, he gave the command to fire. 2 torpedoes struck the Indianapolis on her starboard side. The first hit the forward section and detonated in the ammunition magazine. The explosion was catastrophic, a wall of fire and shrapnel that killed dozens of men instantly and tore through the bow of the ship like paper. The second torpedo struck near the fuel tanks, which erupted in a column of burning fuel that lit the sky and rolled across the deck in waves of orange fire. Men who had been sleeping were thrown from their bunks. Men on deck were hurled into the water by the force of the blast. The ship's communications were destroyed in the first seconds. She began taking on water at a rate that no damage control team could address. She was already dying. 12 minutes after the first torpedo hit, the Indianapolis rolled onto her side. Her stern rose into the air, and she slid beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea. In those 12 minutes, approximately 300 men went down with her. The remaining 900 found themselves in the open ocean at midnight, most of them covered in thick black fuel oil that had spilled from the ruptured tanks. The oil coated their skin, their eyes, their mouths. Some men had life jackets. Many didn't. A small number of life rafts had deployed. The water was warm, about 85 degrees Fahrenheit, but the men were injured, disoriented, and terrified, scattered across miles of dark ocean with no lights and no way to signal for help. And then they began to wait for the rescue that did not know it needed to come. What happened next in the chain of naval command is one of the most damning institutional failures in American military history. When the Indianapolis failed to arrive at Leyte Gulf in the Philippines on July 31st as scheduled, no alarm was raised. The Port Authority logged her as overdue and did nothing. A distress signal had actually been sent during the sinking. 3 separate stations received it. One commander was reportedly drunk and ignored it. Another had ordered his staff not to disturb him. A third assumed it was a Japanese trick and dismissed it entirely. The USS Indianapolis had vanished from the Pacific, and the United States Navy had decided, through a series of catastrophic individual failures, not to look for her. For the men in the water, the first day was about survival in its most basic form. They organized themselves into groups, the officers trying to maintain some structure in the chaos. Ensign Harlan Twible found himself in charge of a group of 325 men, the largest single cluster of survivors. He conducted head counts. He tried to keep men calm. He had no food, no fresh water, and no radio. He did not know if anyone was looking for them. He suspected they were not. The oil was a problem that went beyond discomfort. It clogged nostrils and mouths, caused chemical burns on exposed skin, and when men tried to drink, and they were thirsty almost immediately, they got mouthfuls of fuel. Some drank it anyway, the desperation overriding every instinct. They would not survive long. And then, as the sun rose on July 30th and the heat of the Pacific day began to bear down on the men floating in their life jackets, they realized they were not alone in the water. The sharks had come. The explosion, the blood from the wounded and the dead, the frantic movement of hundreds of men in the water, all of it had sent signals through the ocean that the predators could not ignore. The species drawn to the Indianapolis survivors were primarily oceanic whitetips, one of the most aggressive open water sharks on Earth, and tiger sharks. They do not behave like the sharks in movies. They do not circle melodramatically before attacking. They come from below, fast and without warning, and they do not stop. At first, the sharks focused on the dead floating in the oil slick. The survivors watched this from their life jackets and tried not to think about what they were seeing. Then the sharks began to move toward the living. Survivor Lowell Dean Cox described it decades later, with the flat, effectless precision of someone who had spent a lifetime trying to process what he witnessed. A shark would come straight up from below, take a man, and pull him straight down. No struggle, no lingering, just a scream, and then the man was gone, and the water was dark. The man next to Cox was taken this way. He heard the scream. Then there was nothing where his fellow sailor had been. The sharks attacked in a pattern that survivors described as relentless but not continuous. They would disappear for a time and then return, strike suddenly, and vanish again. The larger groups of men, who kicked and thrashed and made noise together, sometimes drove them back. The men who had drifted away from the groups or who had weakened from their injuries and stopped moving were the most vulnerable. A man going still in the water was, to an oceanic whitetip, indistinguishable from the dead. But the sharks were not the only thing killing them. Thirst arrived with terrifying speed. The human body in warm salt water loses hydration faster than almost any other environment. The sun overhead, the salt on every surface, the exertion of treading water hour after hour. By the end of the first day, men were beginning to drink from the ocean around them. Every survivor would later say the same thing. They knew, intellectually, that drinking salt water would kill them. Some drank anyway. The salt water accelerated dehydration, sent sodium levels in the blood spiraling upward, and began to destroy the kidneys. The men who drank it did not die from the salt water directly. They died from what it did to their minds. The hallucinations came on the second day. Men began to see things that were not there. Some reported seeing the Indianapolis below them in the water, completely intact, with the galley open and fresh water being distributed. They dove down to reach it. Others saw cities on the horizon, or rescue ships that weren't there, and swam toward them until they drowned, or a shark found them. Machinist's mate Granville Crane later described men so deranged by thirst and salt poisoning that they drew knives and turned on each other, fighting, stabbing, killing their own shipmates in the open ocean while the sharks circled. The groups were fracturing. Men who had been holding together through the first night were now dying, going insane, or simply slipping beneath the surface alone. Ensign Twible kept counting heads. The number kept going down. On the second and third days, the sharks continued. Eugene Morgan, a boatswain's mate who survived, would later recall a cargo net with roughly 15 sailors clinging to it. 10 sharks hit it simultaneously. When the water settled, the net was empty. Captain McVeigh had survived the sinking and was floating with a smaller group some distance from the main clusters of men. He was wounded, but he was lucid, and he kept his group together, rationing what little they had, watching the horizon for aircraft or ships that did not come. He had sent a distress signal. He did not know it had been ignored. He did not know that 3 different stations had received his call and done nothing. By the third day, August 1st, of the 900 men who had entered the water, perhaps 600 remained alive. The rest had been taken by sharks, or drowned, or died of their injuries, or swum toward hallucinations and never returned. The sun baked them during the day, and the ocean chilled them at night. Their life jackets, waterlogged after days of constant use, were beginning to lose buoyancy. Men who fell asleep found their faces slipping beneath the surface. August 2nd, 4 days after the Indianapolis went down, Lieutenant Wilbur C. Gwynn was on a routine patrol flight over the Philippine Sea when he spotted something in the water below, a large oil slick stretching for miles, which he initially took to be the trail of a Japanese submarine. He descended to investigate, and then he saw them. Men. Hundreds of men in the water, alive and dead and everything in between. Gwynn immediately radioed his report. The message he transmitted has become one of the most haunting phrases in naval history. Many men in the water. What Lieutenant Gwynn found when rescue aircraft and ships converged on the coordinates was beyond the preparation of anyone who hadn't been in that water. The surface of the Philippine Sea was covered in oil, debris, and men, or what remained of them. The survivors were barely recognizable as human. Their skin had been burned by the sun and eaten by constant saltwater exposure until it hung from them in sheets. Their eyes were swollen shut from the oil. Many could not speak. Some could not move. Some were still fighting, kicking at sharks that had followed the groups for 4 days, refusing to stop even as the rescue ships arrived. The PBY flying boat that first reached the scene could not land safely in the open ocean. The swells were too high. The pilot, Lieutenant R. Adrian Marks, made a decision that violated standing orders and landed anyway. taxiing through the water and pulling men aboard until his aircraft was so overloaded it could not take off. He tied survivors to the wings with parachute cord and kept going. He would not leave men in the water to wait for surface ships. One by one, the destroyers arrived through the night of August 2nd into August 3rd. The USS Cecil J. Doyle, the USS Bassett, other vessels. They pulled men from the water in darkness, in oil, in states of injury and delirium that their rescuers had no framework to understand. Ensign Wren, one of the rescuers, later described the faces of the men being lifted from the water, black with oil, eyes white, teeth white, round and staring and alive in a way that seemed almost impossible after what they had endured. Of the 900 men who had entered the water on July 30th, 316 were pulled out alive. 579 men died in the water over those 4 days and 5 nights. The number killed specifically by sharks is unknown. Estimates range from a few dozen to 150, making it, by any measure, the deadliest shark attack in recorded human history. The rest died of exposure, dehydration, salt poisoning, their injuries from the torpedoes, or from the particular madness that comes when the body and mind are pushed past every limit they possess. The Navy delayed reporting the disaster to the public until August 15, 1945, the same day it announced Japan's surrender. The nation was celebrating. The worst single naval disaster in American history had been quietly folded into the noise of victory. What followed the rescue of the Indianapolis survivors is, in some ways, as dark as the sinking itself. Captain Charles McVeigh had survived 4 days in the water. He had kept his men alive. He had done, by every survivor's account, everything a commanding officer could do in an impossible situation. The Navy court-martialed him anyway. The charge was hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag, a technique used to evade torpedoes. The fact that McVeigh had not been warned he was sailing into known submarine territory was not considered exculpatory. The fact that Commander Hashimoto himself, the Japanese officer who sank the Indianapolis, was called as a witness and testified that zigzagging would have made no difference to his attack did not save McVeigh. He was convicted. McVeigh was eventually restored to active duty and retired as a Rear Admiral in 1949. But the letters never stopped. Families of the men who had died held him responsible, and they wrote to tell him so. Christmas cards that read, "Merry Christmas. Our holiday would be a lot merrier if you hadn't killed my son." Year after year, decade after decade, he kept a toy sailor figurine that had been given to him as a boy, a lucky charm he had carried through the war. On November 6, 1968, Charles McVeigh was found dead on the lawn of his home in Litchfield, Connecticut. He had shot himself. The toy sailor was in his hand. He was 70 years old. In 1996, an 11-year-old boy named Hunter Scott saw the movie Jaws, which features a famous monologue about the Indianapolis delivered by the character Quint, and became obsessed with the real history. He began researching for a school project and eventually testified before the United States Congress, advocating for McVeigh's exoneration. In October 2000, Congress passed a resolution formally stating that McVeigh's record should reflect that he was exonerated for the loss of the Indianapolis. President Bill Clinton signed it into law. It had taken 55 years. The wreck of the USS Indianapolis was discovered on the floor of the Philippine Sea in August 2017, 18,000 feet below the surface, resting in 2 pieces where she had fallen in the dark on July 30, 1945. She was found by a research team led by Paul Allen, using a historical analysis of ship logs and submarine records to narrow the search area. She is still down there. Of the 316 men who survived, most lived with what they had seen for the rest of their lives in the particular silence that survivors of unimaginable events tend to keep. Tony King, one of the last survivors to give extended interviews, sat in his apartment in San Francisco and traced slow circles in the air with his hands, describing the sharks moving below him in the water, and said, "So many friends. Gone." The sinking of the USS Indianapolis remains the greatest loss of life at sea from a single ship in United States Navy history. It is the worst shark attack ever recorded. It is a story of institutional failure, of individual courage, of a secret mission that changed the world delivered by men who were then forgotten in the water. It is a story about what happens when a system that is supposed to protect people simply looks away. And it happened because one commander was drunk, one didn't want to be disturbed, and one thought it was a trap. 3 decisions. 879 men. Thank you for watching this one all the way through. The story of the Indianapolis is one that I think deserves to be told without shortcuts. These were real men, with real names, and what happened to them in that water was real. They deserved better than they got, and the least we can do is remember it clearly. If this kind of storytelling matters to you, consider joining our Patreon or becoming a channel member. Your support is what makes it possible to research and produce videos at this level, and it means everything. Next time, we go back into the ocean, but this time, the horror isn't what's in the water. It's what's on the surface, and what a group of survivors were forced to do to each other to stay alive. You will not forget this one.